Hey y'all! In this series, we've shown you what's wrecking Texas education. How a way of teaching called critical pedagogy means that teachers can train your kids to become social justice activists no matter what the state curriculum says. And we've shown you why Texas kids aren't learning to read. Because a teaching method called critical literacy exposes kids to reading material that will spur them to activism, not to proficiency in reading, while the teacher adheres to the state curriculum. Hint, it's not a curriculum problem. And now we'll show you what happens when people educated to become activists go to work at our Texas historical sites. Welcome to Varner Hogg Plantation, a historic site in Brazoria County run by the Texas Historical Commission. Stop by Varner Hogg on any given day, and depending on who's working the visitor center, you might be shocked at what greets you. On one visit, for example, we were told photography isn't allowed on the side of Varner Creek where the ruins of the slave quarters and sugar mill are, out of respect for how slaves were treated. Bear in mind that photos are allowed at Auschwitz. They're allowed at the site of the Goliad Massacre, the Alamo, and other sites where atrocities took place. Think about how often we hear that Black history is erased or marginalized and ignored, and you'll understand how stupid it is to tell visitors they may not photograph places where this history occurred. Now, I hope this was a one-off experience and not the policy of a state-run historic site. But Varner Hogg has posted the same no photographs policy to their official social media accounts, disabusing me of that hope. For the record, we were not given the no photography spiel by other employees on subsequent visits, just the once. So the same no photographs employee advised that I should watch the informational video in the visitor center so I could learn how they're changing their narrative at Varner Hogg. A peculiar thing to tell a visitor who's just stopped by to learn some local history, but alrighty then. I watched the video. It's about 7.5 minutes long, not including the credits. So there's a 200-year sweep of history at the site, about 40 years of which were blighted by slavery. 6 minutes of the video are about slavery or convict labor, leaving only 90 seconds for the rest of the story. Let's sample some of that video.
Varner Hogg does not bear the patent name. You know, there was Martin Varner, who was the first owner. He would have been one of Austin's old 300. And then it skips the Patton family era and goes to the Governor Hogg era. So it's, in that way, it erases the history of Patton Place or the Patton Plantation.
No, this presupposes that someone seeing the names Varner and Hogg at the site would assume no slavery happened there. The history is not embedded in the name, y'all. The average visitor knows who neither Varner or Hogg was, to be honest. It's the site's job to tell people who those men were. And hell, the word plantation is right there in the name. And Martin Varner, the first owner, owned slaves. But the site would rather focus on the next owner, Columbus Patton. The Hoggs referred to the place as the Varner, probably because it's located on Varner Creek. And what about the owners after Patton and before the Hoggs? Do we claim that they've been erased, too?
Although slavery had been abolished in the northern American states.
Nope. In 1824, when Martin Varner arrived, many northern states were still struggling through gradual emancipation. The North still had people enslaved by other people. There were still people living in slavery in New Jersey until 1865.
Although slavery had been abolished in the northern American states and in Mexico, slavery existed in Texas as indentured servitude, a legal sleight of hand that helped convince slave owners to come to Texas.
Wrong again. The indentured servitude law did not happen until 1828. And the rules changed numerous times before 1836. Next.
After hundreds of years and after decades of ancestors that had dealt with this bondage, I can imagine the jubilant atmosphere that it created for the enslaved people to finally know that their prayers have been answered and that they were finally free.
So why are we relying on Mr. Collins to tell us how an entire population of people probably felt when we have the narrative of Sarah Ford, who actually lived at Varner Hogg, to tell us how she actually felt when freedom came? A little more history and a little less emotive speculation would be nice. We actually have 2 former slave narratives that the makers of this video could have drawn upon. The problem with those narratives is they talk a lot about a brutal overseer named Jake. We're going to talk about Jake in a little bit. Now stroll around the gift shop at Varner Hogg and marvel at the selection of highly politicized books related to current events, not history. Titles like White Rage and books by Ibram X. Kendi being sold under the auspices of the state of Texas. And while you're in Brazoria, check out the Levi Jordan Plantation site too. It's about 20 minutes up the road from Varner Hogg. In the brand new visitor center, you'll find an even more fabulous array of books, such as an Afro-vegan cookbook, modern Black radical memoirs, books by Black feminists, a copy of Roots, more Ibram X. Kendi, modern books about systemic oppression, children's books about diversity, equity, and inclusion, current events, historical fiction, not a lot of history, for sale at a state-run historic site. What is conspicuously absent is the diary of Levi Jordan's granddaughter, Sally McNeil, who lived with her grandparents on the plantation for a time and wrote about it. The book is still in print. THC even mentions it on their website, but it hasn't found its way into the gift shop. We asked the cheerful employee in the visitor center, what's the plan for the recently restored home on the Levi Jordan site? Would they present it as it appeared in the 1850s? Nope. She said the home will be dedicated to telling the story of slavery. So what happened? How did these sites come to focus almost exclusively on slavery when they have so many stories to tell? Is that okay? And why is the story presented from an emotional angle rather than an objective historical one? Is this THC's fault? Not directly, no. The Texas Historical Commission does control the story told at each site they run, but THC runs a lot of sites across the state, and it's part of the state bureaucracy. The commissioners aren't exactly out visiting the sites that they run, and there are layers and layers of management. So the commissioners rely on the well-educated site directors and interpreters hired by the state to tell a full and accurate story at each place. Or at least that's what they hope happens. The truth is, the folks at the top don't really know this stuff is going on. Heck, the folks in the middle may not even know, honestly. But now they do. In the case of Brazoria County, an activist was hired in early 2022, straight out of college following a THC internship. This employee planned to problematize the story being told at Varner Hogg, just as critical social justice professors and teachers taught her to. This is what you get when you hire an individual with a master's in community development, not historic preservation, not history, who did a THC internship developing a diversity, equity, and inclusion toolkit. This is what that gets you. Quote, I personally believe that we are all entitled to live in communities where we are proud, culturally engaged, protected, and have access to our mental and holistic needs. End quote. When a potential employee starts talking about safe spaces and holistic needs at a historic site, you should politely show them the door. Now, I mentioned Overseer Jake earlier, a man who looms large in the existing first-hand narratives of life at Varner Hogg. At the site, you'll learn about specific acts of gruesome brutality perpetrated on slaves who lived there. Here's a quote from THC's website about it. Quote, records mention the punishment of slaves by whipping, including 2 runaways who were recaptured and fitted with irons of some type to secure them, and the attempt to sell one person who was considered to be too troublesome to manage, end quote. What this statement on THC's website conveniently omits is that these brutal punishments inflicted on slaves were administered by Overseer Jake Steele, a black slave. The records referred to are the remembrances of Sarah Ford and Anthony Christopher, who lived at Varner with Jake Steele. They witnessed his punishments firsthand. Now, that's not to say Jake was alone in punishing the slaves, but it is to say it was Jake's job, and Jake should be credited with his well-documented deeds at Varner Hogg. That makes the story more complicated than the conventional victim-oppressor narrative that's presented there. The story told in full makes it all the more thought-provoking. Why advocate for talking about uncomfortable history and then completely erase Jake's story? You'll also hear a lot about Rachel, who's one of the most complicated and fascinating characters in Brazoria County lore. She was a slave who lived as her owner, Columbus Patton's wife, for more than 2 decades. At the site, you learn about her unique life there, that she had a horse that was hers alone, that she spent wads of cash with local merchants on fabrics and finery, had house servants to wait on her, luxuries many of her white counterparts lacked. This social media post that talks about Rachel's greatness and how she was, quote, her own authentic self, uses images of 18th century paintings to portray how marvelous she was. Not exactly. These paintings portray how marvelous free West Indian women of color were, alongside their servants, as painted by Agostinho Brunius in the 1780s. Brunius made his living selling idyllic depictions of plantation life to wealthy planters, so this was probably a bad choice. Trying to portray how marvelous Rachel was when we have no images of her is also a bad choice because it's detached from history and reality. What you won't learn at Varner Hogg is that Rachel, or Miss Rachel, as the other slaves called her, took her role as mistress of the plantation very seriously. According to contemporary accounts, she often berated overseers for leaving the slaves unattended, encouraged overseers to whip them, and even whipped them herself if need be. Rachel wouldn't churn butter, but she'd sure trade butter churned by other slaves for household goods in town. The full story makes Rachel's life a far more captivating one because of its complexity. She and Jake Steele were both the oppressors and the oppressed at the same time. They were exploited, but they exploited others when they had the power to do so. Both could roam freely with Patton's money in their pockets, and both abused their fellow slaves. Yet on paper, they remained the human chattel of Columbus Patton. At a time when we're fixated on words like agency and power, shouldn't we be talking about historical figures like Rachel and Jake? We should, but we don't because it doesn't fit the activist, simplistic portrayal of history being presented in Brazoria County. When site employees seek to problematize history rather than simply telling the stories for which we have documentation, this is what happens. We end up presenting a semi-factual video to the public that trades in what people of the past might have felt instead of talking about the figures we actually know something about. All we've done is swap the paternalistic Gone with the Wind narrative for one that's equally deceptive and inaccurate. Employees problematizing history is also how we end up with this gem of a THC job posting, currently promoted on social media and on THC's website. The position to be filled is that of a complex manager who will direct Varner Hogg, Levi Jordan, and the Sabine Pass Battleground historic sites. The job posting reads, in part, quote, "This is a unique opportunity to educate, inspire, and engage the public to reflect upon the history and culture of people of African heritage in Brazoria County. It will encourage visitors to celebrate the fortitude, tenacity, hard work, intelligence, creativity, and ingenuity demonstrated by people of African descent. It will inspire visitors with story of resilience, maintaining their culture and heritage in the face of social constructs and a changing political environment." End quote. Say what now? It is tragic how little we can know about the lives of people who were ensnared by slavery. The very institution itself kept them from leaving their words behind for us to study. But it's utter folly to fill in those gaps with emotional celebrations of things we have no way of knowing to be true. No population is a monolith. Slaves were people with different personalities and different talents, just like other people. There is nothing that can justify the subjective emotional language in this THC job ad. And is emotional subjective history what we want at our state-run historic sites? Varner Hogg's documented history affords interpreters and educators a rare opportunity to teach the public about a complex place with some truly thought-provoking figures, and to talk about slaves as people in full. And they are failing miserably under the direction of an activist staff. So what about other sites run by THC? Well, a pre-visit guide for 7th grade teachers who want to take their students to Casa Navarro heaps praise upon Jose Antonio Navarro for his strength of character and his service to Texas. A well-deserved assessment, to be sure, but there's complete silence on Navarro's ownership of slaves. We know enough about Henry and Patsy Navarro, two of the people owned by the Tejano statesman, to discuss them at the site that bears his name. Since the current yardstick by which we measure a dead man's entire life and character is how he felt about slavery, shouldn't that be part of the visit? Now, the post-visit guide for high school students ironically encourages them to think about why the site leaves out a discussion of Navarro's position on slavery, while again, just omitting that he owned slaves. A teacher's visit guide for 7th graders to the Reconstruction-era home of Confederate General Sam Bell Maxey claims to provide historical context for the house by describing Maxey's paid house servants. In this 2-paragraph description that's supposed to provide context about how the house was built, half of it is about the servants who worked there. Additional resources for teachers at the end of this THC-branded document are links to the Southern Poverty Law Center's Social Justice History website, the Howard Zinn Foundation, and the critical pedagogy website Facing History. Social justice activism at work, funded by your tax dollars. So at the end of the day, do we talk about slavery? Yeah, hell yeah, we should. And we talk about it at places like Varner Hogg, where it actually happened and where we have good accounts of how it played out. This is a huge opportunity. I would actually argue that the knowledge we have of slave life at Varner is the most historically relevant thing to present there, just as the 1836 battle is the most relevant part of the Alamo's historical arc. But it's not the only thing to present there. There are other stories that must have space. But if we're going to do that, if we're going to talk about it, we have to do it right. We have to hire scholars, not activists. We have to talk about it in a contextualized, objective way instead of instructing students and visitors how they need to feel or how people from the past probably felt, all the while sweeping inconvenient documented facts under the rug. You need to talk about what you know, not what you know makes you feel good. Should we talk about Tejano patriots who owned slaves? Yeah. If that's the yardstick we're going to use to measure some people, it needs to be the yardstick we use to measure all people. Better yet, we could just present the whole picture of a man's life and let visitors sort it all out. Should the state of Texas be promoting cherry-picked propaganda disseminated by the Zinn Foundation and SPLC? God, no, that's embarrassing and it's dumb. Should the state of Texas be hawking books like White Rage at our public history sites? No. Current events don't have a place there. Again, that's embarrassing. These are the real-world results of critical pedagogy and critical social justice education. This is what we get when we hire people who learn activism instead of history at school. And it's more widespread than what I have time to give you here. So like I said, I don't believe this is how the state of Texas or the Texas Historical Commission intend for our history to be depicted. I believe it's just an oversight issue. Activist employees are the problem, and now it's time for us to solve that problem. We've turned over our historical associations. We've turned over our history departments. Are we willing to surrender our historic sites too? I don't think so. Join Texas History Trust in asking the commissioners of THC to address these issues immediately. Here's the email address. Drop them a line and let them know activist site educators gotta go. Texas has no interest in social justice historic sites.